Good evening, Atlanta. Thank you very much for showing up. I've heard a lot about the crazy traffic here, so it says a lot that you're here and that you're here in large numbers. So I certainly don't need to reiterate the importance of the TRRC's work, and in particular, your ownership of what we do. Because as I keep saying, this is your commission, it is our commission as a whole, and we're simply the facilitators. We're the people who are helping bring to light what's happening there, but we're doing it on your behalf. So your participation and your ownership in the process, it cannot be overstated. An important aspect of your participation, an important aspect of your participation means that we must explain a lot of the process and the proceedings and what happens behind the scenes so that you are better informed, and with that information you can give us more feedback, we can have more discussions, and you can better have an input in the process as a whole. So my topic is on the TRRC's procedures and the process. All that really means is that I will talk about the rules and the procedures that govern how we conduct efficient research. We have a very short time to do so, the mandate is 2 years. How we conduct proper investigations, and what we do behind the scenes when we're preparing for hearings. And I hope that once I finish, that will give you additional information so that you will understand what is happening. Some of you might be wondering what's happening to my right, and that's Commissioner Ka interpreting for one of our commissioners. And so we want this to be as inclusive a process as possible. If people want to ask a question in a local language, please feel free to do so. Similarly, when I talk about some of our processes, you'll understand the fact that we put a lot of premium on ensuring that there are people with the necessary language skills to ensure that everyone participates. Some people cannot speak English, some people prefer to express themselves in a language other than English. They're all Gambian languages, and so we cater to that. So at the TRRC, we have what I would call 3 main processes, 3 main ways in which you can participate in what's happening right now. The most visible, of course, is the hearings. I will talk about the research, the investigations, and the hearings. But apart from that, there are 2 other components. One being the dialogues that we conduct with various communities. So this diaspora engagement is an example of that. So we go out, in the Gambia, we go out to the communities, we meet various people, and the objective is to really tell them more about our work, to answer questions and concerns they may have, to register the feedback on our process, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that what we're doing is being done in the best possible ways. So we welcome ideas, we welcome criticism, we welcome divergent views. So that's one of the objectives of these gatherings. But additionally, I believe the ambassador touched upon this. We use it as an avenue to get more statements, to have more people involved in the process, and to explain the different ways in which you can be involved. Because I think some people shy away from participating in the process because they believe that it means you must appear as a witness in public. And that's just one of the ways in which we do what we do. So I'll start by explaining the process of filing complaints. So when we're in gatherings such as these, we'll have statement takers, we might take your contact details and follow up. But the statement aspect is one way of you informing the Commission of the human rights violations that are out there. So we believe we know the types of violations that have been committed. We've done our research, but it's very important for people to better inform us so we know what else we're missing. We might not be looking at something that is very important simply because we don't know, or it's something that was overlooked at the time and so hasn't been documented in any way. So your participation in the process by filing a complaint gives us additional information that will help our work. Another aspect is that if you file an application, you can be considered as a victim within the mandate of the TRRC. And what that does is it opens you to a lot of resources at the TRRC. So you can access certain services such as psychosocial support that we have, which we provide to victims as well as their family members. It also makes you eligible for reparations, and that's an important aspect. Ms. Bakotosawa will tell you a bit more about reparations, but there are different types of reparations that you can access. So it's very important to be involved in this process for numerous reasons. So when I talk about filing complaints to inform the Commission about human rights violations, essentially what am I talking about? What constitutes human rights violations within the Commission's mandate? And I believe that is not so clear, so it's important to clarify what criteria we have at the Commission. All of the TRRC's work is governed by the TRRC Act of 2017. That act defines what our mandate is. Within the act, there are 7 acts that are listed as human rights violations within the Commission's mandate. These are torture, unlawful killings, sexual and gender-based violence, enforced disappearances of persons, inhumane and degrading treatment, arbitrary arrest, and detention without trial. Within the Act, it says human rights violations include, and it lists these 7 acts. So it means that we can include other types of human rights violations. So I'll explain to you how we've interpreted that word include, that inclusive language, to better inform you of the scope. So what these human rights violations share in common is that they all have some element of physical violence or undue restriction of personal liberty. So that is an element that we continue into, that we include when we assess other types of human rights violations. I will tell you the reason for that, but just to clarify a bit further, perhaps I can tell you what types of violations are excluded from the TRRC's mandate. Whenever we come across purely violations of purely economic rights, that is something that's excluded within the mandate. It would only be considered if there is some element of, again, the physical violence or undue restriction of liberty. An additional thing that we exclude as well is unfair dismissals from the civil service. There were a lot of those occurrences during the previous regime, so that's something that's excluded within the Commission's mandate. Similarly, the illegal appropriation of land is excluded within the Commission's mandate. And I'll explain the reason why. First of all, our mandate is for 2 years. It's a very short period of time, and as much as we would love to do so, we cannot look at everything. If we try to look at everything, we would not do our work well in relation to what we should look at. So it's really a pragmatic decision. So on the one hand, we want to be as broad as possible to capture as many human rights violations as possible, but at the same time, without making it so broad that it's unmanageable. So for that reason, we've decided to limit it such that there should be enough violations to give us an impartial context, but there are violations that are excluded. But that's not to say that if those violations are excluded, there's no other recourse to seek redress for those violations. The TRRC is one of many transitional justice mechanisms taking place right now in the Gambia. So for example, when we had the Janet Commission, they looked at purely financial aspects of what occurred in the previous regime. Similarly, we understand that at some point there will be a lands commission. So when I said that issues regarding illegal appropriation of land is excluded, it's because there will be something that will address that. Similarly, when it comes to unfair dismissals from the civil service, the ombudsman is still there. That's another avenue where people can go to address that. Additionally, when it comes to purely civil matters, the court system is still there in relation to civil disputes. So it's really about telling you the scope of the TRRC's mandate in a way that we can do what we need to do in 2 years. So whenever we receive complaints from people, once you know what human rights violations we look at, what you can do is to contact the TRRC. So in Gambia, people would just walk into the office, or they would call a particular number, and someone will figure out the best way of making it accessible to them. I mentioned our community dialogue, so sometimes we go out into the regions in order to collect statements. In your case, one thing you could do is either give a statement here, because we have statement takers, or you could call a particular number, and I believe we will share those that contact information. But you call someone from the TRRC, and they will figure out the best way to take a statement from you. So it could be that someone spends time on the phone taking down your information and taking down a full statement. It could be that you decide, look, I'm too busy, just send me the form and I will fill it out, I'll send it back to you. If you need additional information, let me know. That's another avenue. For some people, the telephone is too impersonal, so they'd rather have something like a video conference where you can then see each other and then they take down that information. So just to say that there are many different ways of doing it, and we really do our best to cater to the different needs of people. Similarly, as I mentioned before, there are different language expertise within the TRRC. You want to speak Jola, that's available. You want to speak Wolof, that's available. Mandinka, Fula, you name it. So the staff that we have really do represent all the different languages, and we make it as easy as possible. So once the TRRC receives this statement or this complaint from individuals who have suffered human rights violation, or who are submitting an application on behalf of someone else. So for instance, a child submitting it on behalf, I say a child, let's say a young adult, on behalf of a parent or on behalf of another family member. Once we receive that, we go through an assessment of its admissibility within the TRRC's mandate. So it's the legal team that will assess that to determine, one, is it the human rights violations that I talked about? Two, is it within the period of July 1994 and January 2017? An additional thing is when we're making recommendations about each individual application, we decide, is this a direct victim? If yes, then that's easy for the person's application to be accepted. If it's not a direct victim, then in Gambia, we're all related to each other. So one of the things that we need to assess then is what degree of relationship is the Commission going to accept? Simply because some of the more, I guess, maybe conventional criteria might be too restrictive for Gambia. Sometimes in your family, you might have guardianship over someone, and that's not necessarily through a formal process, but it's just our culture. People, do take care of many different people. Sometimes you might be responsible for people that you're not even related to. So we need to make that assessment, and we look at some kind of first degree relationship. So not one that is so far removed, because otherwise, like I said, we're all related to each other. So it would not be mandatory. Another thing is when you file an application, on the application, you can choose to have it confidential. So your name will be known to the people in the Commission, and it would not go beyond that. So even if we're preparing a final report, we would put that information in a way that does not reveal your identity. You can also choose to file an application anonymously, but that has consequences. So it's more that you're providing information to the Commission to be aware, but if your identity is anonymous, meaning not even the Commission staff know it, then you can't, for example, have access to reparations. It's just a pragmatic, it's a practical thing. You can also choose to be public and choose to, for instance, say you'll participate in public hearings if you're selected. So that's another thing. So we know which people are interested in, appearing in hearings and which people are not. And so the mere fact of filing an application doesn't mean you will end up in in a public hearing. We try to make sure that there are as many avenues as possible so that you can participate in the process. So the legal team will assess that, and they'll recommend to the commissioners, accept the application, reject it because it's not within our mandate, or seek for further information because something is not clear. And at the end of all of that, we will maintain a victims register just to keep account of how many victims fall within the Commission's mandate. And when it comes to reparations, it will be important to figure out the different types of reparations. And Ms. Bakotosawa will address this. It's not just about monetary reparations, compensation. Of course, that is a part of it, but there's so many other types of reparations, and she will address that. Another big thing is the research and investigations. So the hearings that you see on your screens, what goes on behind the scenes to make that possible. When we first looked at the situation of human rights violations, the lead council decided to have investigative themes that reflect the context over 22 years. So that's where you saw themes such as July 1994, November 11, 1994. Currently, we're doing April 10 and 11 student demonstrations. You saw the junglers as well. So there's some themes that are more, that follow a particular time frame. So they make sense because you start from 94, move on to 95, 96. But there are certain themes that cut across. So some of you would have noticed that right now we're doing 2000, but when you heard the testimonies of the junglers, you saw that we went all the way to 2012. And that's simply because it makes more sense to do it that way. It wouldn't make sense to call a particular person to just talk about 2010, or 1995 or 1996 or whatever the year is, rather than just have that one person come and testify about all that they know, even if it cuts across multiple years. So that's the explanation for, it looks like we've gone all the way to 2010 and then now we're at 2000. It depends on the theme. Some are not restricted in time. So after the investigative themes, we conducted research and mapping. So the research team will take a particular investigative theme. So let's say November 11th, and they will do some research and mapping to find out what types of human rights violations what types of human rights violations were conducted during November 11th. Okay. And then when they look at that, they determine where did those violations occur. As you saw, there were violations at Fajara Barracks, there were violations at Yundum Barracks, and there were violations elsewhere. Then they'll also try to determine what's the scope of victimization? What type of victims are we talking about? Do we have the identities of some of these victims so we can reach out to them and take statements? They'll also address who are the people involved in this incident, either because they have relevant information or because they're people who are possibly alleged perpetrators. So that kind of mapping is done, and then the legal team and the investigations team sit down and try to assess, okay, what do we do next? So from that research and mapping, we follow the investigative leads. We contact people, we get statements, we continuously analyze what we receive. We assess the credibility, the reliability of those statements. And for the most part, the investigations are directed so that we cover as much as possible. So November 11th, we tried to cover the killings, we tried to cover the torture, we tried to cover the people who were arrested. Either they went through trial or the ones where we thought they didn't go through trial. So we tried to give as much a scope of that victimization and what occurred as possible. How am I going that far? Okay. I know Anna is very strict with the time, so I have to be focused. Another thing we determine is what type of responsibilities are we talking about. It's not just about who gave the order, that's important. But in some cases, it's about who had an obligation to act and they didn't do so. Who, for instance, aided and abetted what occurred. You'll notice that with the Gambian situation, there are many different players. When it comes to institutional hearings, we'll do an assessment of people who enabled the human rights violations or institutions that made that possible. And that's very important because institutional reforms are one of the best ways of ensuring that these acts don't occur again and don't repeat themselves. So perhaps you've heard, but we would, for instance, look at the NIA as an institution. We will look at the Ministry of Justice and the Judiciary as an institution. We will look at the prisons, for instance. So that's also something that the TRRC will look at. So once we evaluate the evidence before us, we assess the different types of information we have. We conduct witness selection. So one question is, how do we conduct the selection of witness? The legal team makes an assessment and recommends to the commissioners, who then decide whether or not to approve what we recommend. And we look at a number of factors. We look at the type of human rights violations that occurred. We look at the gravity of the human rights violations. We look at issues such as age, such as gender. We want to be as representative as possible. We look at whether they come from different regions, the witnesses that we're selecting. And we also look at the credibility of the witnesses and the reliability of the information. There are times where you'll notice that we present witnesses that give different accounts of the same thing. And that's a deliberate act because that's something the commission has to deal with. We've heard two sides. Which side is more likely to be the truth? So after the selection, it's about the hearing process. So there are different types of hearings, as you've probably seen. They're the public hearings where you know the identity of who's testifying, and it's all conducted publicly. There are private hearings where we either have full or partial anonymity. And that's because not all witnesses are in the same position. We're able to receive all the information and make an assessment. So we conduct an objectively justifiable risk of the public testimony. What would it mean for the witness? At the end of the day, we don't want to be in a situation where we put a witness in a worse of situation than before they came and testified at the TRC. So you probably watched one testimony where we had an anonymous witness, and so you didn't know the identity of that witness. There was, of course, a lot of guessing going on, but the idea was his identity was concealed. Recently, you heard the testimony of a witness whose name was very well known, but her face was distorted. And that's simply because it was a very well-known story. It was very difficult for her to testify without people knowing her identity, and that's something she consented to. But her main issue was she wanted her face covered because she'd spent so much time dealing with her victimization and trying to get over it. The last thing she wanted was to then be defined by it. So people pointing and saying, oh, that's her, that's her. So she was known by name, and even after her testimony, she's still known by name, but people aren't able to identify her. So there are times where we have to do that because of the nature of the human rights violation or the particular circumstances of the particular victim. But you'll notice that it's an exception. Most of our hearings are public, that's the overriding principle. A third type of hearing is when we have closed session. And those are the hearings that you would not hear about. You will see at the end of the day in the final report that that testimony will probably be referred to and some information will be put in the final report. But those are really cases where we've decided it's too risky to have those people testify, either with protective measures or in public. And I think because those are so exceptional, there has to be some, we ask for your understanding. You've selected commissioners. There are 11 commissioners who receive all the information about the people concerned, and they're in a position to make their own assessments about the credibility and reliability of these individuals. But there are simply very exceptional cases where we will not allow those people to testify publicly or confidentially if they don't want to. An example in the Act is if a child is to testify, our Act says the child must testify in closed session. So that's not even a discretion that the Commission has. Another type of witness that's mentioned in the Act is if you have a sexual and gender-based violence victim. The Act says that you may hear that person in closed session. So it's a discretion. There are certain we have to be careful of painting everyone in the same brush. There are some victims or survivors who want to testify publicly about what happened to them. And we encourage that when they want to. It's just we explain all the possible consequences so they make an informed choice. But there are other people who will choose to testify in closed session, and that's something that, especially with sexual and gender-based violence, we understand our society, we understand the risks of coming out and testifying about that openly. So when victims choose to do so in a closed session, that's something that we also allow them to do. In general, for the hearings, you'll notice that it's a voluntary process. So whenever people come and testify, it's because they're willing to do so. The Commission has the power to subpoena people to come and testify, and as you saw in the case of Mr. Yankuba Toure, we exercise those powers to summon him to come and testify. But then again, this is a power that we have access to, but we use it very limitedly. In general, we want people to come in and testify because they recognize the importance of this national project, and they want to contribute to it. So prior to witnesses testifying, we conduct what's called a pre-hearing meeting. And during that meeting, we discuss with all the different witnesses, we discuss what they should expect during the hearings. So explain how the proceedings will unravel, what's required of them. We also tell them more about their rights, their duties, and their obligations. Because we believe it's very important for our own credibility to be very transparent about the process and to give people as much information as possible so that they decide when they come in that they're doing it because they understand what they're getting themselves into. So one example of that is to explain the potential consequences of testifying. There are some people who come in and they're going to testify about things that they've done to other people, so human rights violations that they've committed. And one of the things that we have to explain is we do not have the power to determine what happens to you in relation to your institution. Because there are some institutions that might decide to suspend someone because of that. There are some institutions that will wait until the TRRC's recommendations. But we make it clear that we don't have the power to control that. And so for that reason, we are fully informing the person. And in a lot of cases, when it comes to people adversely mentioned, we spend a lot of time talking about their right to counsel and the fact that they can have lawyers. So their lawyers can be present at the interviews, the lawyers can be present during the hearings, but we do limit the interventions that a lawyer would make during the actual hearing. It hasn't happened so far, but you can imagine if you allow all lawyers a free range, what that process will turn into. And I believe I'm almost at the end because I look at the time. So during these pre-hearing meetings, another thing we do is to conduct a risk assessment. So before that person comes and testify, we get as much information about their personal situation, their own personal security, so that we can make an assessment about that. Similarly, we provide counseling services so that witnesses can meet counselors before they even testify. And of course, they have access to that even after they testify. So that's for witnesses and their family members. And a lot of this is to ensure that we're mentally preparing people for what they're about to go through. You can imagine it's a very daunting experience to testify in public during proceedings that are live streamed across the nation and around the world, essentially. So for a lot of people, that's daunting. And so we spend time going through that and trying to make sure that they're as comfortable as possible. As I'm sure you can imagine, when it comes to victims, we don't force any victims to testify. Where we would probably use our subpoena powers is in relation to persons adversely mentioned or alleged perpetrators. And lastly, in terms of the questioning, you would have already seen for yourself, we try to ensure that our questions are as neutral as possible. The questions are respectful, and that's simply because that's the way we are supposed to conduct business in the Gambia. Respect is a very important part of our culture. We make sure that our questions are non-confrontational. So there are exceptions where more confrontational types of questions are used to elicit the truth from the witnesses. But that's done in the very exceptional circumstances. And In that, the assessment has already been made that this person will not give the information willingly, and so there's a need to have more robust questioning. I believe I'll leave it at that for now. I'm more than happy to answer questions about the process, but I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Haraja, for a very detailed presentation of the processes and procedures of the TRRC. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to remind all of you, for those who haven't signed the attendance sheet, could you kindly sign the attendance sheet for us? That way, if we have any information and newsletter from the TRRC, it could also be distributed to all the participants present here. Hadi is also at the forefront with the t-shirts, so if you haven't gotten a t-shirt yet, please make way to her and buy a t-shirt. There's also refreshment provided at the back, so anybody who might want water or snacks, it's available at the back of the room. I will now, hold on. I've also been informed Ajera has a membership table at the back for anyone interested in becoming a member of Ajera. You can go and meet them at the back of the hall. Thank you, sir. I would now like to call on Ms. Musubakoto Sawa, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the TRRC. Musa will do a presentation on how the TRRC currently supports victims and on operations, speaking more specifically on our Victim Participation Support Fund and the Victims Reparations Fund. Musa, you have the floor.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. As Anna rightly mentioned, my name is Musa Sao. I'm the Deputy Executive Secretary of the TRRC. So we basically manage the business of the Commission and also head the Secretariat. When you look at the Commission on TV, it looks perfect for most people, but there is a lot of work that is done behind the scene, and those are the people that we have the opportunity of leading. So I would like to thank everyone again for coming here despite your busy schedules. We know, like in America and all, actually in the diaspora, time is money. But you were able to come here because you acknowledge the fact that this is important. It's a meeting that the TRRC is conducting with people or Gambians in the diaspora. When we talk about the TRRC and the services that we render to victims, we know like there has been a lot of controversy around what is the TRRC doing for victims. To start with, when the TRRC started, Dr. Baba Galejala was the only person who was appointed at the time, and then I had the opportunity of joining him in July 2018, and subsequently other members of the Secretariat were hired. One of the units that the TRRC created is what we know as the Victim Support Unit. At the Victim Support Unit, we have a coordinator who is assisted by another person, and then also the Victim Support Officer. In addition to that, acknowledging the fact that 22 years of massive human rights violations must have left quite an impact on the lives of not just persons who have been directly affected, but also persons who have been indirectly affected. As a result of that, we thought that there is need to put together another team of 3 who would offer psychosocial support for the said victims as well as their families. But again, understanding that the expertise in psychology is very limited in the Gambia, CSVR in South Africa was kind enough to second a senior psychologist to the TRRC to support the other 2 Gambian staff who are already doing a great job as far as offering psychosocial support is concerned. But then also the TRRC, when it comes to victim support services, it's based on certain quality assurances as well as principles. And some of these are, the TRRC is victim-centered. We at the TRRC acknowledge that without these victims, there would not have been any Truth Commission set up in the Gambia. So everything that we do is centered around these victims, their interests, amongst other things. Another issue, of course, is an acknowledgement that confidentiality is key. We know like sometimes there is a lot of backlash around information sharing. We're not hearing this from the TRRC. They're not open to the public, amongst other things. But this is because
there have been so many compromises over the last 22 years of dictatorship. A lot is on the line for certain people. Respecting that is part of keeping their information private to ensure that there is non-disclosure of it. Because sometimes we forget that there are certain social, cultural dimensions that motivate against several other issues. And this will take me to the idea about the do no harm approach that we use at the TRRC. For us, our intention is that every single victim who walks into the TRRC gate would leave feeling better than they did when they had come in. And this was why the psychosocial support unit was created. Most often we know that mental health issues are not taken seriously in the Gambia. Unless and until someone starts walking on the street naked, we do not think that there are implications. This is because when someone goes through trauma, for example, it has an impact on their lives. We've seen people who were initially very jovial, proactive individuals, but all of a sudden they've shut down completely. And at times, unfortunately, we would say, this person doesn't know him or herself, this person is antisocial, not knowing that the stress and trauma that they've been through, that every single time that they have, they recall such trauma or such memory, it puts them in a dark place. And this is why we say that we use the do no harm approach in such a way that when a victim comes to the TRRC, they go to the victim support unit to have their data taken. They're registered there. The next thing that happens is they are referred to psychosocial. Psychosocial unit would make an assessment of whether or not this person can have their statement taken based on the gravity of their mental status. Once this happens, referral is made to the research and investigations unit. So at the research and investigations unit, statements are taken. Of course, the legal team would consider who is going to appear before the TRRC and who is not going to testify before the TRRC. So written statements would of course be submitted, but it's not every person who has submitted a statement who would give a testimony or who would testify publicly before the TRRC. But when this happens and it's now time to testify, the psychosocial support team again would come in to make an assessment of whether or not such a person is capable of testifying publicly. And then their reports would of course advise whether or not such a person would appear. So this continues to happen pre-testimony as well as post, after they have testified as well. We still make an assessment and continue to do so, not only for the direct victims, as I have talked about earlier, but also their families, because we know that this has in one way or the other had an impact, a negative impact on their families as well. Of course, the TRRC is gender sensitive. We know that gender is not just about women, but in order to ensure that, because again, like I discussed earlier, there are certain socio-cultural dimensions that motivate around the persons who appear before the TRRC to even submit a statement. For example, about 323 people have submitted a statement to the TRRC or have registered at the TRRC. But out of the 323, only 52 are women. We ask ourselves the question, why are women not coming out? Many would say, well, probably majority of the victims of jamming are men. This may not be the case. There are women also we know who have been seriously violated during this 22 years of dictatorship. We know that there is a lot of sexual gender-based violence victims who this has been perpetrated against them by the president himself or the former president himself or by persons acting on behalf of the state, persons of authority. So as a result of that, but because of the society that we live in, where victim blaming is very central to everything that we do. When you are a victim of sexual violence, for example, the first question people would ask is, oh, what was she wearing? Why did she go to that office? Oh, she knew. They do not even try to understand the disproportionality when it comes to power. That a lot of persons who perpetrated such violences against these women are persons of authority. And these are women who may not have such authority. So as a result of this, in order to ensure that when women also walk into the TRRC, in the process of statement taking, gender issues would be teased out to help the research and investigations unit in ensuring that they ask the right questions so they do not also re-traumatize these persons who come to the TRRC. In doing so, a unit, special unit that focuses on women was created. So we named it the Women's Affairs Unit to ensure that they, again, would be able to look at all these statements that are brought before or that the statement takers have taken, and would also, in addition, tease out the gender issues. It looks like it's prayer time, so we may need to take a break.
No, if they want, anybody want to pray.
Okay.
Habib, that's your call.
Let's continue.
Take a break.
Okay.
Let's keep
going.
Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot of distraction ongoing in the hall presently. I do know that some people are going out to pray. We kindly ask that this is done quietly, because we're going to continue with the discussions here. Gentlemen at the back, we respectfully ask that you kindly leave the hall quietly to enable us to continue with our proceedings. I think it's better we take a 10 minutes break at this juncture, and then we'll continue afterwards. The meeting is adjourned.